Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. I'm Mike Sprague. I'm with the Wilson Center, and I'm so happy that you are all joining us today for what will be a most consequential discussion. I am joined once again by my colleague, Kim Reitmeyer, the Executive Director of the ANCSA Regional Association. And together with Kim, I've had the honor and the pleasure of facilitating this three-part series entitled Alaska Native Communities in Perspective, ANCSA at 50, where we focused on the creation, the importance, the evolution, the impact of Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the Alaska Native Corporations. Today's discussion is the third and final in this series, but based on the response, I have a feeling that Kim and I will be doing a few more of these down the road because they have been quite popular and of high value. Today's program, Alaska Native Communities in Context, Women's Leadership through ANCSA, is the focus of this most appropriate last in this three-part series. As you may recall, on March 25th of this year, we co-hosted our first ANCSA at 50 program entitled Realities of Life in the 49th State. And then in June of this year, we co-hosted the second ANCSA at 50 program entitled Alaska Native Corporations in Context, Advancing Alaska Native Peoples and Communities. A brief but important thank you to Algoonaq Corporation from Wainwright, Alaska, for their foundational and continued support of the Polar Institute. Without their support, we simply couldn't bring programs like this to all of you. I also want to thank our partners today and through this series, ANCSA Regional Association and the Alaska Native Village Corporation Association. This has been a wonderful partnership. And also to Treon Burgess and the entire team at the Wilson Center throughout this entire series. You have created the environment in which we've been able to carry out this work. So I want to thank you all. And finally, my friend and colleague, Michaela Stith, who has always helped us to create the content, but also enables this work to happen. So Michaela, thank you. We have an outstanding panel of ANCSA leaders joining us for today's discussion. It will be recorded and placed on our website so that you can refer to it in the future. And Kim and I encourage our colleagues and friends to send us questions so that we can make this interactive and we can make it as inclusive as possible. So please email us your questions throughout the program, and you can do that at polar@wilsoncenter.org, polar@wilsoncenter.org, and we will do our very best to get to your questions. So now it's a pleasure to transition the program appropriately to Kim Reitmeyer, who I've said is the Executive Director of the ANCSA Regional Association. Kim, thank you once again for this great friendship and partnership, and I turn over the virtual floor to you.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you to the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center for hosting this event. We're excited to be back here for our third event in the series. As Mike mentioned, my name is Kim Reitmeyer. I'm the Executive Director of the ANCSA Regional Association, or ARA, which represents the 12 land-based Alaska Native regional corporations. Our member organizations proudly represent over 140,000 Alaska Native people. ARA's purpose is to promote and foster the continued growth and economic strength of our member organizations on behalf of their Alaska Native people and our communities. I am a member of the Shunak tribe of Kodiak and a proud shareholder of Koniag, my Alaska Native regional corporation. We've been privileged to have an incredible selection of panelists for our series thus far, but I must admit that I'm most excited for the group we've lined up for today. This powerhouse panel of Alaska Native leaders includes 3 women with a wide range of experience and knowledge of both Alaska and Alaska Native corporations. As we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act this month, I'm excited for them to share how each have seen their regions overcome a range of challenges and evolve to better serve Alaska Native people and communities. You'll also get to hear how our panelists have taken a unique path to assume the leadership roles they hold today. We're also ecstatic to have our senior senator from Alaska and also the first Alaska-born senator, Senator Lisa Murkowski, joining us to provide opening remarks. In addition to being an incredible leader and a role model in her own right, the senator has been a tireless champion of Alaska and Alaska Native people and communities during her term in Congress. No more has this support been more welcome than in the past year and a half as we encountered a grueling litigation where our Indigenous eligibility was called into question by groups who misunderstand our organizations and the critical services we provide. Senator Murkowski continues to advocate on our behalf for a CARES spending extension to ensure our communities can fully realize the relief funds they only recently received as a result of the litigation. The senator currently serves as vice chairman of the Committee on Indian Affairs. She's an appropriator and ranking member of the Interior Environment Subcommittee. And of course, she's the former chairman and still a top member of the Energy and Natural Resource Committee. Senator Murkowski is certainly no stranger to any of us or the topics we'll be discussing today. Thank you, Senator, for your efforts past, present, and future on behalf of Alaska Native people. Your commitment to Alaska Native people makes us proud, and we are so glad you could join us today. It's my privilege to welcome Senator Lisa Murkowski to deliver opening remarks for today's event. Senator, the floor is all yours.
Kim, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to open this panel of very distinguished Alaska Native women leaders. I'm pleased and honored to just be on for just this short period of time. So good morning to you if you are in Alaska. Good afternoon if you're with us on the East Coast. But I also want to acknowledge the role of the Wilson Center Polar Institute and what they have done for not only bringing this event together, but the previous ones over the course of this year, as we have really talked about the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, the fact that this is the 50th anniversary fast approaching. The ANCSA Regional Association, the Alaska Native Village Corporation Associations that are also co-sponsoring. Again, thank you not only for what you're doing here with this event, but all that you do throughout to provide for so many in such exceptional ways of leadership. As I mentioned, we're just about 10 days now from ANCSA's 50th anniversary. Plenty of room to reflect, to celebrate, to acknowledge that legislation is never perfect. I noted that in this morning's edition of the Anchorage Daily News, there's yet another front page article. So as we're looking to what 50 years has brought, I think it has also been a renewed education for Alaskans everywhere. When I think about this law, I really do reflect on how far we have come. What began as an experiment in 1971 is now truly a source of empowerment for Alaska Natives and for the state as a whole. The regional, village, urban corporations that ANCSA chartered have grown into truly economic powerhouses that deliver very real and very significant benefits for their shareholders, for their communities, and really, again, all throughout Alaska. The investments that these corporations make are building and diversifying our economy, whether we are talking about fisheries, resource development, tourism, information technology, it's all across the board. Today, ANCs generate billions of dollars in dividends to support the well-being of their Alaska Native shareholders. They fund scholarships that open the door to higher education. They offer internships to provide really that very crucial early professional experience. And we see them play out in real time, that these internships lead to permanent jobs and successful careers back home within their region, within their villages. So it really is paying that forward. ANCs are also helping to support and perpetuate Native cultures and languages, facilitate healthcare, other critical services through the nonprofit foundations. And they do all of that and more while upholding and truly upholding Alaska Native values. I mentioned that ANCSA was not perfect when it passed, nor have the many improvements that we have put in place along the way made it perfect. There are still issues that are unsettled or unresolved. I've just recently reintroduced landless legislation to resolve an injustice for 5 Southeast communities. It's not easy to do. We know that this will be challenging to get across the finish line, but it has to be made a priority. It was a commitment made that must be a commitment kept. Another near-term priority, and it's not near-term, it's immediate, it's right now, and it's what you have mentioned, Kim, and that is the deadline on the CARES Act and the extension to spend those dollars. As we know, ANCs received this in the aftermath of the Chehalis litigation, but late. And again, not only was that legislation, not only was the court ruling significant, incredibly significant in terms of making certain and providing clarity that an ANC is not just a corporation, but instead very intimately involved in providing care and services for their community. So you all on this call probably know we included an extension of the CARES Act deadline in a bill that unanimously passed the Senate, where we're working with the House to pass it before this December cutoff. It's been a priority for the entire delegation. Instead of doing my homework last night, I was on the phone late into the evening, talking with lawmakers, talking to the White House, talking to anybody that would listen about what we need to do to advance this priority. It continues to be an imperative. I think it is important for us to acknowledge that even as we're continuing to improve ANCSA, it really does stand as one of the foundational laws in Alaska. The corporations that have been created have been pivotal to Alaska Native self-determination, and as I mentioned earlier, true anchors for our state's economy. It's probably impossible to tell the story, the full story of ANCSA, or to understand how its future may unfold without knowing about the people who shaped it and who continue to make it a success for our state. And so the event today, focusing on women's leadership, is particularly important. ANCSA has reshaped the lives of many Alaska Native women, but it wouldn't have been possible or anywhere near as successful without their strong leadership. Women helped craft its language. Women are now leading many of its corporations and nonprofits, but we don't stop often enough to recognize those roles. According to Alaska Business Monthly, 18 of the 20 top Alaska-owned companies by gross revenue are ANCs. Women are the chief executives of nearly half of our regional corporations, many of the village corporations, and hold senior leadership roles at nearly all of them. So we're seeing the role, the leadership in so many areas. Kim, you are certainly an example as a strong female leader there at ANCSA Regional Association. We thank you for all that you do. Hallie Bissett has been leading the Alaska Native Village Corporation Association and doing an extraordinary job. And of course, Julie Kitka at the helm of the Alaska Federation of Natives for years. We have seen many strong, really incredible Alaska Native women, and to know that we have several of those leaders with us today as part of this discussion is wonderful. I feel privileged to know them all and to call them all friends. They come from different regions, different generations, but each has an incredible story to share. So Gail, Liz, Rosita, thank you for being part of this discussion, for the work that you do on behalf of thousands and thousands of Alaskans. We are blessed that Alaska Native women helped lead the way on ANCSA back in 1971. And now 50 years later, we're proud to have so many strong women who are leading our corporations, our nonprofits, and the related entities that it helped to create. So I simply couldn't imagine a better group to tell us really about what ANCSA truly is, means, and does, and how it has impacted the lives of so many across our state, especially for women. So thank you for the opportunity to help kick things off. And thank you for your important, critical leadership. Thanks, take care. Guneshish.
Senator, thank you so much for joining us today and those remarks. I think everything you mentioned really touches on what we're going to talk about today, and I think it lays the groundwork for a fantastic conversation today. Thank you for your leadership, for being a mentor, for being a woman that so many of us can look up to in your position, and always holding true to your values and leading by your values and by your heart. We greatly appreciate having you lead us and represent us and being here for us today. I know you have an incredibly busy schedule today, and we invite you to get back to your day, because I know you have a lot to do, and we're just so gracious you could spend the time with us today, this morning.
Kim, thank you for that. And if I might say, I would love to stay, but we are taking up an Indian Affairs Committee hearing in just a matter of minutes, focusing on the tribal provisions in VAWA, an issue that for us in Alaska, for so many, we know that we must do a better job when it comes to protecting our Native women. And this has been a key initiative for many, and know that today's discussion in committee will be very important for the direction going forward. So I want to thank those who have helped us get that legislation on its path. And with that, I'll sign off and wish you all well and happy holidays as you go through this season. Take care.
Quiana.
Quiana.
Well, I think that the Senator's remarks really lays an incredible groundwork for today's conversation, and I'm so excited. I just really want to jump in as soon as possible. Typically, we do kind of short introductions, and I'm going to ask for our panel this morning and this afternoon to expand a little bit when you introduce yourselves. Each of you has played such a pivotal role in my life and my career, and getting to know you and the work that you do. I would just really like, not only in your introductions, if you could tell us a little bit about growing up in Alaska and what helped you prepare for the roles that you're in today, and how ANCSA influenced how you, where you ended up today, and your background and history. And we're gonna go ahead and start off with Rosita, and then Gail, and lastly with Liz. So Rosita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I was trying to think about what I'm going to say about myself, and I note that I've been appointed to wisdom councils, and I've been featured in wisdom books, and I guess that means elder. And I have a long life, and it's been a wonderful life, and I'm proud to say most of my life has been devoted to the Native community. But first of all, my Tlingit names are Yadeklisak and Kahani. I am an eagle from the Thunderbird clan and the House Lord from the Sun. And I am also a Chilkat and a grandchild of the Tlukakadi clan, or the Sakai clan. My English name is Rosita Wurl, and I currently serve as the president of the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute. And I also served on the Sea Alaska Board of Directors for 30 years. And I now currently serve as an emeritus director. The board never defined what that meant. And I said I defined it for them, and it means the big boss. So I also served on the Alaska Federation of Natives for 17 years. And most of that time, I also served as the chair of the Subsistence Committee. I would try to get off of that committee. I resigned. Then they appointed me to the Alaska Policy Committee, and then they put subsistence under that committee. And I resigned from the board, and then I was reappointed to the board. So I'm still on the AFN Subsistence Committee. I've been fortunate in my lifetime of having a good education, and that good education, first of all, began with a traditional education. I was in Tlingit style. Some children are given to grandparents. I was given to grandparents, and that becomes like our social security system, caring for our grandparents. And at that time, they didn't believe in schools, and because they didn't like the population that had come into our country. And unfortunately, the welfare didn't think that was too good. So I'm one of those children who was kidnapped and brought to a boarding school. And that's another story that we're going to be addressing, here in Alaska, as it has become a very major issue. And then I would have to say that I got involved in the war on poverty, and it was really great because at that point in time, the government was looking towards Native people and minority people and people of color, impoverished people, and gave them some actual power with making financial decisions. And I found out that I thought that people were listening to me because I was an Indian, because I was Native. And I said, I don't want them to listen to me just because of that. So I decided to go off to school. I dragged my 3 kids and went off to school and ended up in the North Slope doing research for 10 years, and then went into Canada, did some research there. I'm an anthropologist by training. And so I've had the privilege of doing research, throughout Alaska. And then I came back home when people said, hey, we thought when you went off to school that you were going to come back home and work for your people. And I was just having so much fun doing all the research up in the Arctic. I forgot about coming home. So I came back home. I worked for Governor Cooper, and I'm proud to say that I did the first study that looked at how much Native people were bringing into the state of Alaska because of their special status as Alaska Native people. And I reminded the governor and the legislature, if we weren't going to recognize the special status of Native people, the special political status, then we should be better prepared to replace that money. I also published a magazine during the 1991 legislation, and that was very exciting because I was involved right at the forefront of those issues. So, and then I worked for Tom Berger on the Alaska Native Review Commission, and at that point in time, I decided that it was important for me to become more engaged with the Native corporations, and so that started my road into Native corporations. So, and I'm now privileged to serve Native people through Sealaska Heritage Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosita. You have truly dedicated your life to our people, and we're so incredibly grateful for all that you've done, and we just can't be thankful enough. So appreciate you having me here today. Gail?
Thank you. My name is Gail Antschubert, and I was born and raised in Yunlakleet. I am a tribally enrolled member of the native village of Yunlakleet and a direct descendant of the last traditional chief and shaman of Yunlakleet. I was one of 9 children born to Lowell and Betty Anagik. My mom is still alive. In fact, she just flew back to Yunlakleet this morning. She's 95 years old and still insists on living alone, which is somewhat of a concern for us. But Native women, I think, have been really strong people throughout the history of our different cultures, and also Angska. I know that there were a number of Native women who played an important role in Angska. I worked on Wall Street for 8 years after getting my law and business degree. And in 1992, I decided to move back to Alaska. And I really felt that I needed to do something to try to help the people of the region. And so when I moved back in 1992, I ran for the board of directors of the Bering Straits Native Corporation. And by some fluke, I was elected to the board. There was someone from Yunlakleet coming off the board. And so I was able to win the seat that he had served on. I've really been blessed to have worked for Bering Straits Native Corporation since 2003. And it really has been a real educational experience for me. I was fortunate to work with some of the really early NGSA leadership, Kim's dad and Roy Hondorf and Karl Mars and the Oliver Levitt and Jake Adams and people from Southeast and actually all over, Ori Williams and Byron Malott and Chris McNeil and others. And it was a real blessing for me to see them in action. And given that, they were the ones that were involved in both advocating for the passage of NGSA and the recognition of our rights, but also leading our corporations early on. Bering Straits, unfortunately, was one of the NGSA corporations that went through bankruptcy somewhat early. And, we reorganized, and there were a number of laws that Senator Stevens and Senator Murkowski and Congressman Young helped pass that helped us and other ANCs to recapitalize. And that included the NOL sale, participation in the 8A program, and then there are other programs that I'm sure I'm not listing. Still today, the center mentioned something early that kind of brought something back to the fore, and that is that our Vietnam veterans who served in Vietnam, who went over there as young teenage boys and put their lives on the line, they have not been able to get native land claims, take advantage of the Native Land Claims Act. And that is something that we have worked on for a period of time. I'm hopeful that at some point in time, Congress will recognize their efforts. A lot of them are unfortunately passing on, but their families are still alive. But I really think that that they need to be able to select meaningful lands and not lands on mountaintops and in areas that really are not in their region. And so that's something that I really feel strongly about and will continue to work on. I really am very grateful to the delegation for all of the work that they have done to ensure that, as we move forward and continue to grow, that we're able to take advantage of a lot of the programs and services that they have created to help us. And so it's been, I think, the joy of my life to have worked for and with the NGSA Regional Association and the NGSA Regional Corporations. It has been a real life learning experience for me, and I continue to learn from everyone with regard to that.
Thank you, Gail. Gail has served a long time as the vice chair of the NGSA Regional Association, and her wit and wisdom that she brings to our board is just incredible. And one of the best things is Gail Shaler's quite a bit about her mother on social media, through social media posts. And I just love the comments and the history that she brings up, telling the story of her mother, and what her mother does today is just mind-boggling. So thank you for sharing that, Gail. Liz?
And her, if I could just interject,
yes.
Her, she always says to me, "Don't put me on the Facebook."
Just tell her she's got a fan base.
She does, actually. Thank you.
She does. Thank you, Gail. Liz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ublalotak, Ublulotak, good morning and good afternoon. I just want to extend my appreciation to the Wilson Center, ANVCA, and NGSA Regional Association for hosting this conversation. Ataga kolok kikik tagrak minurunga, akaga ijiktak Nelly Moore, apaga igak Greg Moore, anaga aporak, atataga Edward Ward. My English name is Liz Carvalho, and my husband and my son are Anthony and Alika. I'm Inupiaq. I'm from Kotzebue. I'm a shareholder who's considered an afterborn under ANCSA, and I'm very grateful for the 1991 amendments and the work that a lot of the folks who just spoke put into the legislation to allow those of us who are part of ANCs who allow us to be shareholders today. And I've been with NANA Regional Corporation since 2010. I like to say that ANCSA has been a part of my entire life. I would like to kind of start at the beginning, so bear with me. My mom is from Kotzebue and my dad is from Ohio. My mom was a journalist, and when my dad came to Kotzebue, he was a biologist studying polar bears who ended up working for the state. He eventually was let go by the state because of his supportive views on traditional subsistence practices. From there, we moved to Fairbanks, where my parents were NANA dorm parents. And what that meant was that NANA had 2 houses on the UAF campus to help support young Alaska Native people, not just NANA shareholders, in getting their education in Fairbanks. From a young age, my brother and I were around young Alaska Native people who were getting their education and coming over to eat caribou soup and talk about things back home. During this time, my auntie Rachel Craig would visit us in Fairbanks while she was taking classes, and she would teach us about the Inupiat Iloquisate, or what we consider our Inupiat values, and reinforce how important it is for us to know who we are and our culture. I can still picture her bringing dried fish to my mom, which she still loves today, and demonstrating Inupiat dancing to us kids. This was a blessing because we did not have the resources to travel and visit our family in Kotzebue very often. When I was growing up, I only got to go home 2 times. Later on, my mom participated in a nationwide Native broadcasting program, and she worked with others to cover the Alaska Federation of Natives Convention every year and other events around our Alaska Native communities. I spent a lot of time at the public radio station growing up. We used to spend a long time in the recording booths with my mom at the AFN convention back when radio editing was done by hand on reels. I also remember listening to Perry Eaton, someone on this call might know him, speak during the resolutions process. And later on, he and other leaders kindly gave their time for interviews on ANCSA for my college senior project at Colorado College. And I can still remember hearing Rosita speak when I was younger, all throughout the AFN conventions. That project stemmed from a deep curiosity about how policy reflects values and how policy and people intersect. That curiosity helped connect me to the opportunity to work for NANA in DC for about 2.5 years, advocating for ANC participation in the Small Business Administration 8A program that Gail talked about. During that time, a group of regional leaders, which included NANA, Manilik Association, the Northwest Arctic Borough, and the school district, came together to advocate on common issues impacting the NANA region, and our team in DC got to support them. It was inspiring. How many places in the country do you see a corporation, a school district, a local government, and a health and social service nonprofit come together in agreement on issues and advocate for them with Congress? Our elders call this a dochikun, or together as one. It's important that we work together as one on behalf of our people and our communities. Around this time, my grandmother, who I had spent very little time with, turned 89. I had to make a choice: move to Kotzebue and spend time learning from her, or stay in DC. Thankfully, I was able to secure a job in Kotzebue with NANA, supporting the advocacy work that I saw in action, and spend time connecting with my Anna and my culture before her passing 3 years later. From that time on, I've benefited from mentoring from women like my Anna, my mom, Marie Green, Lori Henry, Mary Schaefer, Christina Westlake, and many others in my community who've helped me see how we as a region wrestle with the connection between ANCSA, our values, and the work that has gone into to ensure that our corporations stay grounded in our Inupiat Iloquisate, our values. During my time at NANA, I have worked in external affairs and most recently in lands. This includes executing our obligations under ANCSA and related to lands, advocating for subsistence rights in all arenas, and working to manage our role in responsible resource development in our region alongside my colleagues. There are 3 things that come to mind to me when I think about ANCSA. First is that ANCSA is what was possible at the time and the context of the political realities at the time. It was birthed at the intersection at the end of the assimilation era of federal Indian policy, oil and gas and statehood in Alaska, and the culmination of a generational effort by Alaska Natives, both men and women, to retain our traditional lands and our rights to subsist. Second, ANCSA is critical because of the connection between the land and our traditional way of life, but it is one tool in a toolbox of self-determination for Alaska Native people. Third is that it requires constant revision to improve it and ensure that it better reflects the values of our communities, and it is up to each generation to carry forward improvements to ANCSA, ANILCA, and all other laws that impact our ability to be self-determined and to perpetuate our cultures. One more thing that I would share is that though ANCSA is a federal law, its implications have spurred efforts on every level of government, local, statewide, national, and international, to improve the quality of life of Alaska Native people and to ensure that our distinct cultures can continue now and into future generations. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Koinak.
Liz, Gail, Rosita, thank you so very much. We could fill hours following up on any one of these incredible themes that have been started since the senator signed on with us. We won't have time for that, but we will have time for a number of questions from both Kim and I, and also from the audience. So I want to just remind those watching, please be a part of this discussion. Please be a part of this narrative, and email us at polar@wilsoncenter.org, and Kim and I will do our very best to get your questions in. Liz, let me impose upon you, maybe to start the first round here. And as folks know, that we like to have a sequence of how these programs go, but sometimes we decide to just go off on a direction because someone has brought a very important issue up. So Liz, let me ask you to dig a little deeper on the lands issue, right? As you pointed out, it's of great importance to ANCSA, and in particular, your role at NANA. So can I ask you to do a little deeper dive here? It's a two-part question, a little deeper dive to explain why advocating, and I use that word purposely, advocating for lands has always been a crucial part of ANCSA, and why it continues to be something ANCs prioritize to this day. So that's the first part. And Rosita and Gail, we obviously want your thoughts on that. And the second one is related now to your new appointment by the president to the Arctic Research Commission. We would very much appreciate your thoughts about the special role Alaska Native peoples will play in the US's efforts on Arctic research and other Arctic related issues. So if you can marry those two, and by the way, congratulations on that appointment, a significant appointment indeed on a number of levels. So back to the lands issue, if you wouldn't mind, and if you want me to repeat any of that, I will do my very best to do that.
Thanks, Mike, and I'll do my best to answer briefly. I am really excited to hear from Gail and Rosita as well. I think when it comes to advocacy and on land specifically around ANCSA, I think it's important to keep in mind that I think at the heart of ANCSA was our ability to retain our traditional lands as Alaska Native people. Our ANCs were able to retain 44 million acres of those lands, and it was a hard-fought effort. It was not simple, and something that I really appreciated, that I think Willie Hensley, who's from Kotzebue, was very involved in land claims, as well as Mary Schaefer, when we've talked, who was involved in establishing NANA, was just pointing out that getting our land rights is pivotal, not only to ensure the perpetuation of our cultures, but to ensure that we had as much autonomy as possible to make decisions about our lands, to prioritize subsistence or pursue responsible resource development opportunities. And I think to this day, that constant need that I think, Kim, you referenced in your opening remarks that's really important, is that there's often a lot of misunderstandings about Alaska Native corporations and our role, and the direct connection that we have to lands to be good stewards of those lands is very much tied to our ability to perpetuate our culture and our way of life. In the NANA region, we have about 2.2 million acres of land that we've retained, and that's still only about 9.4% of the lands in our region. The majority of our lands are state and federally owned. And so when it comes to advocacy on lands, it's not only that autonomy, but maintaining access to our lands and the ability to think about the resources we rely on, whether that's caribou or fish and the other agencies and adjacent landowners that impact those resources. And so we may be these organizations like NANA, for example, we're over $1.6 billion corporation, and we have a lot of different operations, but we also have an inherent responsibility to protect subsistence on behalf of our people because of the connection to the land. I think going to your question about the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, again, thank you for the congratulations. It's a really humbling, and again, is another good example, I feel like, of Alaska Native women leadership. I'm following in the footsteps of Marie Green, who is a former commissioner, as well as Helvi Sandvik, who's from Kayana, Alaska, and is a former executive of NANA as well. And I think the important role that Alaska Native people have when it comes to Arctic research, but also looking at the role of the United States in the Arctic, is our continued presence. We've been here for over 10,000 years, and we have local and traditional knowledge that is valuable to researchers, is very valuable to any potential defense and homeland security efforts here in the Arctic. I think the Alaska Territorial Guard is one small example of how important that knowledge can be. And I think the unique view that we have of that long knowledge and history that can contribute to the Commission's work, as well as the way the U.S. looks to how we adapt to climate change and the issues impacting our communities, is very important. And we all stand ready to contribute to that, because we are together in this, and we have to work together for a strong future for the Arctic. Thanks, Mike.
Liz, thank you for letting me impose upon you with a two-part question like that, and great responses, great insight and perspective. Let's just stay with the lands issue for a moment. Rosita and Gail, let me ask you, Rosita, first, to maybe comment on this issue of lands and how central lands are to ANCSA, and then Gail, the same question to you. Rosita?
Okay, I'm so excited there's so many things that I want to be talking about. But first of all, I think it's really important for people to know that Native people made a very clear choice about land ownership and what kind of title that they wanted to have. Native people, the Native leadership at that point in time, wanted control and ownership of their land. They did not want to be subject to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as traditionally land settlements put Indians on reservations and held their land into trust. And we here in Southeast had the experience of working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the Indian Reorganization Act, where we established business enterprises. And our people were always entrepreneurs, but we were very stifled with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Somebody making a decision 4,000 miles away, they precluded us from even owning canneries, salmon canneries that came into our region. So Native people were very clear that they did not want to have trust lands. They wanted to have ownership and control of their land. The ANCSA was a land claim settlement. That's what they were looking at, lands and economic self-determination. And so those were the concepts that drove them. Ownership of lands, complete autonomy, and they came up with the concept of corporations. And I think that from all of the research that I've done, the concept of corporations came from the Governor Hickel's land task force led by Willie Hensley. And they initially weren't looking at corporations. All they wanted was control of their land. And so they found out that they could have control of their lands through corporations and lands that are held under fee simple title. So I know a lot of people lament, that we don't have trust lands, but we do have that right to do that. And like here in Southeast, we're looking at transferring our historic sites to the tribes, and hopefully they could put those under land into trust once we take care of the problems we've had in that area. But I just really wanted people to know that those were the ideas of our early leaders. They wanted full control and ownership, and thus corporations were born. I know a lot of people say, oh, they're alien institutions. The concepts weren't alien. It was just the form and structure of it. And I think that our leaders have demonstrated leadership, in managing and developing through the corporations and with fee simple title.
Thank you. I could listen to you talk about this for a long time. Thank you, Rosita, for doing that. Gail, we'd benefit from your perspectives and insight as well.
Thanks. It's really hard to follow these two women who really have touched on, I think, the highlights of this matter. But, when ANCSA was passed, as everyone knows, the Congress divided Alaska into 12 regions, and those regions were defined generally by the common heritage and shared interests of the indigenous peoples within each geographic area. And the division into the 12 regions was generally based on the divisions made by early missionaries who divided Alaska into regions that each of their missions then serviced. And Congress really deliberately took a different approach to federal Indian policy when it passed ANCSA. And they really did not want to create a reservation system for Alaska because the reservation system had failed in the lower 48. And so they wanted to create situations where we could, build our own economies and support ourselves. And so I was 15 years old at the time ANCSA passed. And I have to say that, growing up in the village with very little communication with the outside world, we had one Christian radio station. There really wasn't an understanding or concept as to what this whole issue of land ownership meant. Because in my village, for example, the first real landowner was a trader who happened to be my biological grandfather, who got fee title to some land in Yunlakleet. And before that, and still to a great degree since then, people just kind of respected the boundaries of homeownership in the village. And so the whole idea of owning land was, up to 50 years ago, kind of a foreign concept. Unfortunately for us and many other regions, when land was transferred to us, contaminated lands were transferred as well. And we had a military base in Yunlakleet, and when they shuttered the base, they dumped a whole bunch of toxins, over the hillside and everything. And so there was an effort to clean up those lands, and there's still many, many contaminated sites in the various regions that need to be dealt with. But I think that, given the hand that we were dealt, we have done remarkably well. And, basically just 2 generations embracing this concept of, these being a shareholder in these large corporations, being landowners, and then being, for us, responsible for our shareholders and descendants, and trying to ensure that we provide good benefits to them, scholarships, dividends, elder benefits, and that sort of thing. So ANCSA was, I think, an experiment, and fortunately, for some of us it failed initially, but we basically pulled ourselves back up, and here we are.
Thank you, Gail. And here we are. In a previous discussion, we talked collectively. We talked collectively about all of you on the screen, and the fact that we're looking at a generational bridge here between the 3 of you, right? I mean, this is an amazing arc that's happened. I mean, Rosita was there at the beginning, crafting what today we enjoy as ANCSA and ANCs, as wonderful as they are, and they're not perfect, as noted, right? There's still work to be done here. So can I ask you to just maybe reflect on what I just said, which was a comment from one of your comments to me, which is the 3 speakers here are generational, and are generational through ANCSA, and you are all female leaders. And is there a difference between the male-female perspective during this arc of the ANCSA transition and the ANCs, and the fact that we have 3 women leaders in our state, different generations, living a legacy, but more importantly, guiding a legacy? Can you just respond to that, please?
Don't forget to include Kim Reitmeyer as well. So
I was going to impose upon her as well. She wasn't going to get away.
Great. Yeah. So I think that generally, the early leadership were all men. And, they were the ones that really made the effort to go out to Washington, D.C. to advocate for our rights. And, realistically, if oil had not been discovered on Alaska's North Slope, I think that we would still be trying to advocate for our land rights. And so it really was the early leadership composed mainly of men. There were some women, Fran Dagnan from my village. My mother-in-law, Gail Antschubert, was someone involved as well. But, they were really the ones who spearheaded the effort, and eventually, we're able to have our land and other rights recognized. I think that there has been, just from generation to generation, a growth in terms of the broad spectrum of looking at the various issues that have confronted each of our generations. Rosita has her own story. I have my own story in terms of how, growing up with ANCSA, initially not understanding it, and then realizing that, these corporations could provide good value to our shareholders and descendants, and then trying to, really utilize the resources available to us to make that happen. And I know that both, actually, the other three women probably have different stories and that sort of thing that they would tell, but it's really been a very quick education for, I think, all of the Alaska Native population, in terms of just coming to grips with, just one generation ago, from my perspective, trying to ensure that our rights were protected, to basically running these massive corporations that are now fueling Alaska's economy, and helping to ensure that in this downturn that we seem to be in, that Alaska's economy continues to move forward.
Gail, thank you for that. And so again, we're just going to go organic here and just follow a thread. So Rosita, perhaps the same to you. Maybe I can ask you the same thing, and then Liz, be prepared, because the same question to you, your perspective. So Rosita, please.
Well, I wanted to comment on Native corporations as being different than other profit-making corporations. And I remember in the boardroom, we would have consultants telling us that you can't mix business and non-business. And we would have to come back and say, no, we are a Native corporation, and we are different than other corporations. And I want to go right back to the congressional findings, in which the congressional findings say that Native corporations were to promote the social and economic welfare of Native people. So even Congress, right from the beginning, even though we were established as corporations, Congress saw that we were still very different. They also differentiated us from other profit-making corporations by imposing on us what I call a form of corporate socialism. There is no other profit-making corporation that is required to share 70% of its profits from subsurface development or timber development. I used to be on the board of the National Museum of the American Indians, and I was having dinner. We were having dinner, and we had some Wall Street people who were also on the NMA board, and I was telling them about Section 7I, and they said, "My dear, that is so un-American, and we have to change that law." Well, over the years, we've seen it's been beneficial as a whole, to Alaska Native people, but it does make us very different. We are also different from federally recognized tribes, but we are Native corporations, I want to say, are federally recognized tribes for special statutory purposes. I really like to emphasize that. Initially, we were recognized as tribes for the issues of consultation. And that was primarily because of the large federal land base that were adjacent to our ANCSA lands. So, and then subsequently, we've been recognized in over 100 federal legislative acts recognizing Native corporations as federally recognized tribes for special statutory purposes. And these special statutory purposes provide benefit not only to the Native community, but for our shareholders and the state of Alaska as a whole. But I also want to emphasize that in no way have Native corporations said, that they are sovereign entities. That is an attribute, that is a responsibility of our federally recognized tribes. I'd have to say overall that I think, that as a different kind of corporation, as a different kind of tribes, that I think that Native corporations have been fairly successful in promoting, the social and economic welfare of our people, and also for the state of Alaska, as I think others have pointed out. But that doesn't mean that we've eradicated poverty. It doesn't mean, that our job is complete yet, because we still have many social and economic inequities that we have to deal with.
Thank you, Rosita. Liz?
When I think about that kind of, it's hard to follow Rosita said, like listening so intently. When I think about that generational kind of view, I think of the three of us, and including Kim. There's a lot that comes to mind for me. It's not only that the inheritance of the act itself, the women who were involved in ANCSA, and I know it varies by region. I remember Mary Schaefer talking about how Willie and John Schaefer got together to start the Northwest Alaska Native Association, which was the association that eventually became NANA, the for-profit business. And that was our advocacy organization on land rights. And Mary, I think it's actually on alaskacool.org, are some notes, and she shared this with me too. She remembered when they started getting together, their first meeting, she was leaning out her window in Kotzebue, talking to people who were walking by, inviting them into the first meeting, inviting them to come and share their thoughts and concerns about lands and lands issues, and hearing them talk about how in our communities, some of the first land ownership right was done by town sites. Kotzebue is quite a patchwork. There's town sites, there's some ANCSA lands, there's some allotments. It's really interesting. And thinking about that time and the struggle to think about how to protect our rights as Indigenous people, that autonomy that I think is really critical and central, and how that's evolved over time, and how learning these institutions is really important. And one of the things I think that continues to be a challenge for the next generation, at least for me and for I think for others, is how we continue to educate even our own people about the layers of governance over our communities. Alaska Native corporations are a facet of that, really because of our land ownership. But I think our tribes have a central role, and in our region we have a borough because we have the Red Dog mine, which is the largest lead and zinc producing mine in the world, and has shared over $1 billion in revenue sharing through 7i as the second largest contributor to 7i in the state. And so we have to learn these institutions, how we need that acumen, like someone like Gail going out and getting her law degree and coming back and bringing that in, what we have to do to walk in two worlds with one spirit, how we anchor ourselves in our values. And so when I think about the generational context, it's so important, and it still is important for me to hear, in my experience, to have that mentorship. And I think that means something from what I've heard in each of our stories, who helped raise us, who kept us connected to our values and our way of life. I also think about there's the other thing that keeps jumping in my mind is so many other female leaders who were involved at the beginning of ANCSA. Laura Burke, who was an advocate for ANCSA, really insisted on the autonomy of Alaska Native people and the settlement of the act. She was from Candle. I remember listening to some of the stories that Brenda Itta would tell about the challenges that existed for Arctic Slope communities in the development of ANCSA, and the views about the inherent right that we had to lands. And so I think there's so much that each generation has done and that the next generation has to go back and learn and carry forward, and anchoring not only in the institutions that help us run our organizations, but also maintaining that connection to our traditional and cultural way of life, because that's what makes us distinct and unique.
Liz, thank you for that. All three of you, thank you for that. Kim, I just cannot let this go by without asking your perspectives as well. And then Kim, allow me after you're done to make a final comment, and then I'm going to pass it back to you. Okay, but we would really benefit from your thoughts as well, please.
Thanks, Mike. It's just an honor to be joining the women on the panel today. I think that growing up for me, my mother and father were just such incredible champions and cheerleaders, ensuring that I had all the education and knowledge that I could about our traditional homelands, about our value systems, and carrying those forward. And just had a great father figure, and my mother, that silent champion. But I have this vivid memory that I can share of I play ice hockey. And I was warming up one evening for a game, and a woman skated up next to me from the other team and said, "Are you Perry Eaton's daughter?" And it was Janie Leask. She's the former president of AFN. And she literally put her arm around me, and we kind of skated around the ice for a while she introduced herself. And that started an incredible friendship. And she has just been a tireless cheerleader and mentor for me throughout my career. And I think it's that female mentorship in our Alaska Native values that has been so instrumental to so many of us. And we all have our stories that we can share of who was that person or who are those people, because we have our communities behind us, and it really is across the state and across all regions. In Kodiak, I'm going to steal our theme of, a rising tide lifts all boats. And we see that woven through our traditional value systems so inherently with our women and leading us up. And I'm surrounded by such incredible women on my board every day that are leading these organizations. And it's just amazing. It's just an amazing experience. And I'm just so grateful for it.
Thank you for letting me do that, and all four of you for that, because I think it's really important, for all of us to hear it, to learn from it, to understand your perspectives far better. But I hope those who are not familiar with our state, that are not familiar with ANCSA, that are not familiar with the Alaska Native corporations, they have a better understanding of what the four of you just demonstrated. Yes, there are deep bonds in female leadership and women throughout the state of Alaska, of course. But think a little bit deeper for those who are not familiar with these structures and these efforts. Imagine 12 corporations in the United States, pick your favorite country. Imagine that they had personal, professional relationships. Imagine that their parents knew their grandparents and knew their grandparents. Imagine that their sole effort in life was to lift their people. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about service to state, service to community, and it doesn't really matter what region you are from. You're learning from the past, and you're benefiting from the past to guide forward. And I think that is really what's important about these discussions, is that these corporations, as Rosita so brilliantly laid out, they are so different. But in terms of our state, each of you have talked about the people who have influenced you, the people who you are influencing, and those people that you are nurturing for the future, regardless of regional affiliation, regardless of corporate structure, regardless of title and position within a company. It's irregardless that you are nurturing the past, you're honoring today, and you're moving them forward. And that's what I was hoping that would come out of that, whatever that organic trail was, and you did that. And so, Kim, thank you for letting me take us on that rabbit trail a little bit. But I think it was really important. I certainly learned a whole lot. So Kim, back to you.
Thanks, Mike. Each one of you has really touched on how Alaska Native corporations are different from the word corporation we know in Western business culture. I often share a story of I was in a committee meeting with my board members years ago, and we were nearing the end of the meeting. And one of the CEOs said, oh my gosh, what time is it? I have an elder in town. I need to go pick her up and take her to a dental appointment. And it's stories like that that you only find, and it's very common to find those in our Alaska Native corporations. But I just thought, oh my gosh, here is the CEO of an amazing organization doing amazing things, and he's going to go take an elder to a dental appointment, because it is that personal touch and it is that importance of our shareholders and our people that's so important, and how we differentiate. So I want to talk about that thread a little bit. And in that thread is education. Education is one of the threads that unites all of our Alaska Native corporations and the entities that represent the constellation of our people. And so Liz and Gail, you both pursued your education and your early career outside the state of Alaska. So I want you to kind of build upon those themes a little bit of what it was like, how is it different? And then when you came back home, and in sticking with today's theme too, talk a little about what it was like being a female in those roles and through those experiences. And Gail, would you like to start?
Sure, thanks. So I actually left home when I was, I think, 15 to come into Anchorage for school. And I followed two of my sisters into Anchorage, my sister Martha and my sister Joan. And there was a boarding home program at the time. And so what they would do is they would take young natives from rural Alaska who wanted to attend school in urban Alaska and place us in these family homes and everything. And I had attended 1 year of high school in Yunlakleet and just kind of wanted to see the world. And so I applied for the program, and I was accepted. And when I told my mother that I wanted to go into Anchorage for school, she was really opposed to it. She was not happy. She kept saying, no. And I kept saying, I'm going and you can't stop me. I mean, I guess like a true 15-year-old throwing a fit, right? And eventually she allowed me to, come into Anchorage for school. And I had a conversation with her, several decades later. And in fact, she just raised this again recently during her recent trip to Anchorage. She was the eldest child in her family. And when she was 15, she was told or invited by someone to leave Alaska and go to nursing school. And she really wanted to go. But her mother told her that she couldn't, that she had to stay home and help raise the children. And she really decided at that time that if any of us wanted to leave to further our education, she would never do anything to stop us. And she didn't. And so, my path and the education that I received was really just kind of following my siblings who, kind of paved the way to both first leave the village and then go on to university and then even get advanced degrees. For me, it was really just assuming that I was going to kind of do the same thing that my older siblings had done. I guess the difference was that I ended up working outside for 8 years in New York City. And I remember when I told the partner that I was doing work for that I was moving back to Alaska, he looked at me and he said, I would have thought that you would have gotten Alaska out of your system by now. And I remember just looking at him and shaking my head no, because, as Alaskans, I think that we're unique people, obviously dedicated to our homelands and our families. And so I was really blessed to be able to come back to Alaska and work. And that's kind of, I guess, my story in terms of my educational process.
Thanks, Gail. I can jump in. I left Kotzebue when I was probably about 5 years old, and we lived briefly in Noatak. If anyone has ever seen there's a sketch on Sesame Street, dating myself here, that is, and you back kids singing about how it's winter. Mom worked on that in Noatak with Sesame Street. Like, how cool was that? And that was when we were really little. And so we lived there very briefly when I was young. But I think for my parents in particular, that experience of living on campus at UAF and for them being dorm parents, my mom got close to finishing her college degree. She was part of the first graduating class of high school students in Kotzebue. And I think something that Rosita touched on, and I think to a certain degree to you, Gail, was like the availability of education in our villages has changed significantly over the last 50 years or longer. It's and my parents, I think, were from that young age when we were at UAF with them, kept pushing us. You know, my mom didn't get a chance to finish her degree. My dad came from a family that was educated, and he was working on his master's degree. And my dad would always say to me, "What's the point of college? To finish." And it was like, whatever degree you get. And so my mom would also say the same thing. And so from a young age, we got that exposure, I think, as much as they could, living in a more urban setting to our culture. And I'm very grateful for that, for my Aunt Rachel and others who helped with that, because I didn't have the privilege of growing up at home or learning how to cut fish from a young age. But on the educational side of things, and when it comes to the Western education, we lived in Fairbanks, we lived in Anchorage, we lived outside of Alaska briefly, and then came back. And I got the chance to go to kind of a unique high school in Anchorage that focused on kind of your own individual ownership of your education, and got interested in going to Colorado College for my degree. And part of the reason I think that I felt comfortable leaving, one is I think I was like, I need to go somewhere else for a little while and get my education. But there were also other Native students there. It was a very small population. And I had always heard Mom work with other Native people on radio broadcast. And so that sense that we have connection not only to each other as Alaska Native people, but we do have a connection to other Native people in the lower 48. And it was a really wonderful experience to go to school in Colorado, meet friends from Zuni Pueblo, Navajo Nation, and other places that we were a small group of Native students on that campus, but it was a really amazing experience. I think to your question about kind of what it may have been like as a woman, the thing that took me, I think, to college that got me there, right, is that my mom was a journalist and my dad was a biologist and then an electrical engineer. And I was a self-professed chemistry nerd when I went to college, and I loved chemistry. And I actually did a number of internships in chemistry and found that though I enjoyed it, I couldn't see a future for myself in it. And I was lucky that Colorado College was a strong liberal arts college with a strong science program, because my exposure to the programs I was at there helped me kind of connect that passion and interest to public policy and people. But there were a couple of moments in my college education that I remember that stand out to me. I remember I went to the American Indian Science and Engineering Society conference in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was the first time I saw fall tree colors that were purple. Like, I'd never seen that growing up in Alaska. And I remember this gentleman from NASA was talking with me, because it was a recruitment fair, right? They had booths and there was someone there from NASA, and he just looked at me and he was like, "You're just so amazing. You're this Native woman who is interested in math and science, and isn't that really hard?" And I was thinking, well, it's the math and science isn't what's hard about that. And to me, I was just a kid who was curious and wanting to do those things. And I think I ran into, when I was in college, not only from him and others, into a lot of assumptions about Native people. And sometimes that would come up with professors, and in particular about Native women, and the pressure to go home while you're in college if something comes up, and not always understanding the connection between our culture and our way of life. And so I think through that, I was very fortunate to have others that I looked to, whether they were those students at UF or talking with other Native students about those experiences. It was challenging. Living out in DC for 2.5 years, talking about the SBA 8A program, I think one of the things that I was most self-conscious about was that I'm very aware that I'm mixed. And sometimes people who are not from Alaska, who don't really understand our culture and way of life, might take that as less credible. And it was a challenge for me to know that I didn't get that chance to grow up at home. And I was advocating for those programs, even though I knew I was rooted in my culture, that sometimes people would bring that up. And that was an experience that was hard at times. But it goes back to that mentorship of other women leaders standing firm in our values and advocating, because it's not about us as individuals. We're not an individualistic people. It's about our communities. And so digging deep to find those things, thinking about hearing Dr. Wurl at AFN, or even you, Gail, talking at NACA about the issues impacting our communities and others, it's finding those things that help strengthen us to work on behalf of our communities. So those are just some of the things that come to mind to me when I think about that outside of Alaska experience in education.
Thank you, Liz. I want to remind folks that they can send in their questions to polar@wilsoncenter.org. And we have a question that I think we can take at the moment, Kim, if that's all right with you. This question is for all three of you, but Kim, please weigh in as well. What impacts has ANCSA had on the empowerment of Indigenous people in other parts of the world? Interesting question. Who would like to go first?
I guess I could try to offer some things. We have had visitors from different countries, actually, and looking at the ANCSA model. And we've even had people from Russia. I don't know how that happened, but we ended up having, fortunately, one of my students was Russian and was able to serve as the translator between us. But they were really interested in the ANCSA model. And so I know that it is a model, that other countries, other nations have been looking at. I think it's I think it was a great experiment, if you wanted to call it that, and really leading towards really economic self-determination or economic sovereignty. And so I think it's a model that, other countries, and we've had at least 2 or 3 different nations come and visit us here wanting to learn about ANCSA corporations.
If I could, I wanted to add one thing about my mom from just the last panel, and that is that she eventually went on to get her GED, which prompted my dad to get his GED, because he was darned if his wife was going to have a high school diploma, and he wasn't. And then she eventually went on and got her Associates of Arts degree from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge her, moving forward, despite the fact that, early on she stayed home to help raise the children. And, in terms of the question that was just posed, I have said before that that ANCSA really, I think, in my opinion, was designed to fail. And it really was, and a number of us did fail. But, thankfully, because of the way ANCSA was structured with revenue sharing, we were able to, utilize those funds and everything to kind of bootstrap ourselves and pull ourselves up. And then with the help that our congressional delegation gave us to kind of, reconstitute ourselves and move forward, I think because of that, a lot of us are in the positions that we are in now and successful. And then we have really bright generation following, me, for example, Liz, for example, I have always been really impressed with you, Liz. And had you not said that you did not grow up in Alaska or in a village and everything, it never would even have occurred to me that that was an issue, because you were so tied into the issues that are important to us, and so articulate in terms of bringing our message to Congress. And I just have always been a strong supporter of yours, and I was personally sad to see you leave Washington, D.C., but also really impressed with the fact that you left to take care of your grandmother. That just really struck me. And so it's, it was really kind of a tie from, one generation to the next, and really helping people to understand, what's important, and family is important.
Well, thank you, Gail. And I just continue with the part of that personal exchange. Like, I personally just been so grateful for your mentorship and support and continued support. And it just means a lot to me. And it was an honor to work in DC on behalf of the groups. And I'm also really pleased to be home to contribute what I've got to our communities here. And something I think that I really appreciate too is that what you share about it being set up to fail. I think the willingness to share the experience of the Bering Strait region with other places is so important. And Dr. Wurl, like the leadership of your region to share as well, so important. I remember talking with Marie Green about Inuit Circumpolar Council of Alaska and the important role of the question of land claims and how it came up for our Canadian counterparts. Inuit people were not just in Alaska, we're in Russia and Canada and Greenland. And the questions it raised that led to different models of land settlement in other countries like Canada, but also the advocacy work that someone like Daly Sambo-Duro has done at the United Nations on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that eventually led to Greenland pursuing independence. I think that there's so much that ANCSA, either as an example and an experiment, has contributed to. It's helped us learn, and it continues to challenge us to improve the legislation and ensure that our corporations are rooted in our values. And so I think the question is so important, and I see how much both of you have contributed to that. And in our region, we've received visitors from places like Bolivia, Russia, other parts of our own country, to understand how we balance subsistence and natural resource development on our lands, because we wanted to have that economic independence to pursue our own local borough government, to have schools where students, I remember I came back to Kotzebue, and something like 2 years later is when Kobuk finally got an expansion so they could actually have all the way to 12th grade education. I think they only went up to, I think it was 8th grade. And that just, to think about that in the United States, that we're still challenged with those issues. We still have communities that don't have flush toilets, and we're all working for better infrastructure for our people, and we have that story to share. I think Marie was also involved in talking with Aboriginal Australians, and I think a lot of about the challenges that they face in their country is when it comes to recognition and land rights issues as well. So I think there's a lot that ANCSA and the lessons that ANCs and our Alaska Native people as a whole have shared on that issue that has contributed to the dialogue on what that looks like in other countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. Kim, please.
Thanks. It's a great question. I love this question that came in because, I'll argue that Alaska Native corporations were the first socially responsible corporations. And if you look at the mission statement to provide socially, culturally, spiritually, economically for our people, and taking that unique model forward, we've been in Gail's been in many meetings with me in Washington, D.C., where we've been asked, how can we replicate this model, or how could we use this in other opportunities? And even last week, I was asked how a non-Native owned corporation could implement and act like Alaska Native corporations. So we oftentimes too look at mission statements. Take a look at some of the mission statements of, even the 3 regions represented here. You'll find land mentioned in their mission statement. You'll find culture and people and ancestors represented in the mission statement. And one of the things too is the importance and the value we put on our ancestors and our elders. Every single regional corporation has programs that help our elders, and we hold them in light that I think we're losing in America. Our elders are so important to us to carry those cultural ties and to carry us forward in everything that we do. And I love how that is represented and continued forward, and we're not losing that. Opportunities like this to have these conversations to carry that message forward. And I really hope that, and we see in the political forefront today, if we can lift up each other, and if we can lift up our elders and hold them in light and help them guide us, they have that value, and they have that message that we can't lose.
Thank you. I'd like to transition for a moment back to lands. And Rosita, you're just so passionate about it, so knowledgeable. Every time you speak about ANCSA and lands issues, I learn. So, but what people may not know is that ANCSA as an act is still evolving, right? There's a lot of work to be done. There have been a lot of benchmarks in ANCSA. It just didn't happen 50 years ago and then left. There have been sequential changes, requests for changes, realization that change has to happen. Maybe you can share with all of us what I call the 1991 amendment and what that is, why it's important, and what would change if we follow that thread a little further into the future.
Sorry.
I was on mute telling you that you were on mute. So we're in the same place.
Okay. I've actually called the 1991 legislation, and we call it the 1991 legislation because that's the year in which the restrictions on the sale of land was going to be lifted. But I have actually called it the retribalization of ANCSA. And it was really in the 1980s when Native people began to realize the flaws and the dangers of ANCSA corporations. And so, and of course, the foremost one was subsistence. And I have to say that our people, when they were working on the land claims, land and subsistence were one. We didn't even conceive of them that subsistence would be a separate issue. We thought that with land, that subsistence would be taken care of. And I know that that question came up just at the last moment. And there was actually a Japanese economist that had done a study on the value of subsistence in the Bethel area. And William Paul raised that as an issue. But at that point in time, we were so close to the settlement, that it was, they didn't carry it forward. And I've often wondered why. And it just comes from this belief that land and its resources are so integrated that we just thought that we would be protected in getting that land. But anyway, we in the 1980s, and I will say I was very deeply involved in that, and we were realizing that there were flaws. Although I will say that, and I think Kim had mentioned it, that the Native corporations were already moving towards integrating cultural aspects into the Native corporations. A number of them established nonprofits. When you look at their mission statement, I think all of them talked about culture, made reference to it. They either started nonprofits or they established educational endowments. But then I think that the major one, of course, was the restrictions would be lifted on the sale of stock in 1991. And Native people were absolutely concerned, that they would lose land. And we had the experience of the fishing permits, where we saw our Native people lose control of the fishing permits. So we were frightened that we would be losing land. And I will tell you, at the University of Alaska, people were taking real estate classes thinking, well, I'm going to get ready for when we could start buying ANCSA lands. Well, that wasn't going to happen. And I'm really proud to say that our people met. We, as a whole, and I can't remember, we had workshops, we had board retreats, and I think there was actually 5 AFN conventions where our people came together to look at what were the problems of ANCSA, what were the flaws. And they came up with a number of different concepts that they said were really important that we pursue in the 1991 amendments. And the first thing that they said, first of all, is that we have a communal orientation. And we know ANCSA was designed to assimilate Native people with individual shares. And so the Native people at that point in time meeting in the retreat said, no, we are a group-oriented people. And so we wanted to, make sure that we could take care of our children, that they had a right, to ownership of the land, just as we do in our traditional culture. Because you are a member of a tribe or of a clan, you have rights to that land. So those participants, identified communal orientation. They also talked about respect for elders. And of course, Native corporations, all corporations, have to give equal distributions to all. So we couldn't, take care of elders in the same way that we had in our traditional culture. So they established, things like the settlement trust. The other thing was the land relationship. Native people saw land like they saw their families, that were kin related to one another, this group orientation. But to land, they talked about, they said, it's like our family. We have this spiritual relationship to the land. And they said that our subsistence was important, not only for our food security, but also for sharing, for taking care of the elders, and this sharing, unites us as a group. And then the other interesting thing that they came up with was Native identity. I mean, this would be in the 80s, that our Native people are talking about Native identity. And they said Native identity came from being part of a Native corporation that owned land. And so that stock, that piece of paper, gave our children that tie to the land. So Native identity was important to them. So anyway, they came up with this framework, and then they developed, the amendments that I call, retribalization. They went ahead and established things like land bank. We wanted to protect our land. So land banks were established that, we didn't have to develop our land, and they could be free, from taxation. I know there are a lot more other legal aspects to it, but the fact is important, that they wanted to protect our land. And then they also had the provision to allow for the enrollment of natives born after 1971, because they said without that tie to the land, then we lose our culture. And I know we had a great debate, and some of us wanted perpetual enrollment. And Secretary Hodel absolutely was opposed to us, because again, they saw ANCSA as a way to assimilate Native people into the economic mainstream, but we had very different ideas. And so we ended up with a compromise so that each regional corporation and village corporation could vote on enrolling, their shareholder descendants. And then of course, taking care of the elders. So a number of us have established these settlement trusts where we can give special benefits. You're rewarded for becoming 65. When you're 65, you get a $2,000 check, at least if you're from the Southeast Alaska region. So there were a number of things, that our people consciously, they met, They decided these are the attributes that we want to protect with Native corporations. And, we also wanted to have that ability to transfer land to tribes. But then Congress insisted on this disclaimer clause. And after doing the analysis of that disclaimer clause, we decided not to pursue transferring lands to tribes because that disclaimer clause would undermine tribes and tribal sovereignty. So we said that we will pursue it in the future, and AFN really did pursue it in the future, and they worked, for the recognition of tribes in Alaska as federally recognized tribes. So now we still have this issue of recognizing Native corporations as tribes for these special statutory purposes. We have to be concerned that Native corporations were not included in ARPA or the American Rescue Plan. So that's a task, that we will have to put on the Native table, that we want to make sure that, things like ARPA, I think because we're not included in ARPA, we in Alaska we were deprived of $300 million that could be used to address the many needs that we have, and we do have many needs. So anyway, we're still evolving. This is a task that we're going to have to make sure that we have this uniform application of the definition of Indian tribe that makes sure that Native corporations are included because of the benefits it does provide Native communities and Native people.
Rosita, thank you. Kim, before I turn it back to you, there's like 3 or 4 or 5 things here I'm grateful for. One, I'm grateful that we asked the question. I'm grateful for that narration and that insight that you just gave us, because that's a class in and among itself. So thank you, Dr. Wurl, for doing that. 3, I'm grateful that we have this recorded, because what this entire panel has been absolutely fantastic. And there are clippets here that would be not captured in a way that's appropriate for others to see later on. And that particular narrative just streamed a whole number of issues for us and wove them all together. So thank you very much for that comprehensive response, knowing full well there's a lot more to it than that. Thank you. Kim, back to you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Rosita. I could listen to you for hours. Every time I hear you speak, I learn something, and I'm just so grateful. And as you were speaking, my phone was lighting up with questions. So I'm going to stick with the theme a little bit that you were on, Rosita, and ask everyone too, is the question is, there are many misunderstandings about Alaska because it's so different from the lower 48 tribal reservation system. What is the one thing that is different in Alaska that you wish Americans understood? And I think, who wants to start? Rosita, do you want to start, since you took us off in this great topic? Why don't you start, then we'll go with Gail, then we'll go with Liz.
Well, I think we have to start, first of all, with the understanding that Native cultures remain viable, that we still have our culture, that we still have cultural practices, and that we are culturally different. First of all, we have this group orientation, American society, individualistic. We have the spiritual relationship to the land. It's not just a commodity to us. And so therefore it makes our Native corporations something very different. But then also, I think the other thing is that we have to understand that we have a different institutional arrangement in Alaska than that of the lower 48 and the tribes. And I think it's working. When we've had this 50 years of institutional development and change. We have tribes that have sovereign entities, but they don't have a land base. So it's important that they work with the Native corporations who has that land base. And here we have to make sure that our children remain as tribal members in perpetuity. We want our children to have that tie, to our lands. And then I guess the third institution that makes us different from the lower 48, where in the lower 48, you have the tribes, and they have all of, they have economics, the political, and they also have health. All of these functions are united in the tribe in the lower 48. But in Alaska, we have tribes, we have corporations, and we also have the health corporation. So institutionally, we're different. And I said culturally, we're different in having these different value systems.
Thanks, Rosita. Gail?
As you know, it's really difficult to follow Rosita. I really, Rosita, have been blessed that you've been my friend for more than 20 years, and I've learned so much from you. And I don't know if you've started writing a book, but you really should, because there's so much wisdom, because you lived through the whole experience. You lived in other regions, the North Slope, for example, for as long as you did. And I really have been blessed to be your friend and to learn from you. The description that you gave earlier about how, there was this division, and there continues to be a division of sorts that really shouldn't happen, because we are all Native people, whether we are, tribal or corporate, from the village, from an urban area. I really am hopeful that we could continue to, build those connections. I said earlier that I didn't ask to be a shareholder. I didn't understand what that meant. Even with regard to tribal status, it was just expected that, because I grew up in the village, for example, that I am a tribal member. And, to formalize that, I am now a tribally enrolled member of the native village of Yinlakleet. But when it comes right down to it, when we strip off our tribal clothing and our corporate clothing, our health corporation clothing, we're all one people. And I think that we help to advance the interests of all of Alaska Natives and even the lower 48 tribes by working as one people and not allowing people to put us into pockets and work to divide us. And I really think that we've come a long way, and we still have a long way to go. I'm really excited to see what Liz's generation is going to do, and the difference, and Kim's as well, and the difference that they will make in terms of our growth and our just lives and everything.
May I just throw something in there? I want to thank everybody for the accolades that I've been given, but I have to tell you, I can't take sole credit for all of it. I have many colleagues, that we talk, and one of them is Chris McNeil, and we are so fortunate to have a legal theorist who went to Yale, got his graduate degree there, and then went on to law school at Stanford. And he's, in my mind, one of my colleagues, and I just, learn a lot from him. And right now, one of the things that we're talking about that we really need to do as a Native community is to have a seminar to really look at what the Chehalis decision, the Supreme Court decision, what that all meant together, with the Indian Organization Act and ANCSA. And I think we're kind of right now at the cusp of a whole different, a new field. And I think we need to bring together, legal scholars such as yourself, Gail. I mean, you've had that on the ground experience living it, and with people like Chris and others. And I do think it's time for us to do that. We're at that point in time, with that Chehalis court decision, and then the subsequent act, with ARPA excluding us, and then and some of the infrastructure bill, we're in some areas and we're not in others. And I think as a whole, as a Native community, we need to, to be reviewing that. But my real point was that I can't take sole credit for all of these ideas.
Thank you, Rosita.
Yeah.
Liz, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, I can jump in. I felt like my brain went 80 different places with that question. I had to pick one thing, and I almost feel like I just want to second everything Gail and Rosita said. One of the, I guess, and one thing that I feel like I hope that people recognize too about the difference in what's so different about Alaska in the fact that we have such a different institutional structure is that no single one of those institutions adequately fits into what I would think of as our traditional way of life, or fully allows us to live into that. And what I mean by that is that our tribes represent that important role of sovereignty, and it is our responsibility at ANCs to uphold and work with our tribes. But even that structure does not always completely serve our people, the same way our ANCs don't always completely serve our people. We work to make them reflect that, to improve it with every generation, every iteration. And it is constant work. And I think when I think about our young people, the work that comes to us is also comes in the midst of those challenges of pressures of moving to urban areas, or dealing with the things that create distance between our communities and ourselves, and that kind of increased pressure on an individualistic approach. And something I always appreciate Liz Medicine Crow and others like at First Alaskans talking about indigenizing it, right? Like how we think about our space and what's coming next, and how we have been doing that for generations, and what we have to keep doing, carrying it forward. And it's complicated, but we're all willing to educate, talk about it, and find a way forward. And I think that it's an arc. It takes a lot of time, and it doesn't happen quickly. But man, when we come together on agreement, we get a lot done. It's pretty awesome.
Thank you, Liz. What a great close to that question. I'm getting goosebumps throughout today quite often. We are closing in on our time, and I would kick myself if I don't ask this question of the three ladies on this panel is, what recommendations do you have for the next generation of Alaska Native females? And also, maybe you could share quick fire both questions of, if you had to do it all over again in your life and your career, is there something that you would do differently? And let's start maybe with, we'll go backwards this time. How about we'll start with Liz?
No, I'm just kidding. I feel odd answering the question about what I would do in my life. I feel like I have a lot less time to reflect on, and I mean that in the most respectful of ways, without sticking my foot in my mouth. I think probably the advice that I would have is, coming into, maybe it's because I've wrestled with it, is how to, coming into this space in a corporation, keeping that connection to values. It's also making space for others to do so. Something that is really clear, like working at NANA, and I think this may be true at other ANCs, is the importance of family first, and the support that we give to folks for anything happening in their extended family. Our family structures are very broad and deep, and what it requires of our Alaska Native women is a lot of participation. And I think that a big part of taking care of ourselves and our community is being present in those spaces. And so what I mean is, I guess when I think about advice, it's get that education, but also stay connected, find ways to continue to express yourself. And I think Val Davidson is another good person who points it out, is whatever you want to pursue as a young person that you're passionate about, it's going to help our community. It goes back to kind of the thing that your communities say, Kim, right, is rising tides lift all boats. And as our young Alaska Native leaders, our young Alaska Native female leaders pursue their passions and keep that connection to community, that tide will keep rising. I think the only thing I probably look back on and maybe would change is just I don't know how much I could have changed it though at the time, is that ability to come home more while I was in DC. I mean, that's a limitation any Alaskan feels when they're in college or they're out on the East Coast working a job. Being able to participate, the biggest gift I had when I moved into the lands department and was no longer working the state legislature was I finally got to work on Ugruk from start to finish. And that was a gift. That was pretty awesome to be able to have Pauline Morris and Connie Honeycutt teach me how to do that. And so those are some thoughts I would leave there. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Liz. Gail?
I actually wouldn't change anything because I really think that it helped to prepare me for the job that I have now. You know, working in New York City was incredibly intense, and I worked constantly, and you know, late nights, weekends, because that was the expectation of a New York City law firm. And, you know, quality of life was not a consideration. And I probably, you know, maybe, and I remember thinking this briefly that, you know, maybe I could have a child and my husband could raise the child because I have to work constantly. And, you know, that's probably one thing if I had to redo, I would consider having a family. I have great stepkids though, and great nieces and nephews. And so they kind of fill that void. But, you know, I really have been blessed to, I think, be in the right place at the right time to gain the experience and then to come back to Alaska and really utilize it to try to change the history and the lives of the shareholders of Bering Straits Native Corporation and their descendants. And it's just something that is really very meaningful for me. And I really appreciate being included on this panel. I mean, just really amazing women on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. You've shaped so many lives and so many careers. Thank you. Rosita? Oh, you're on mute, Rosita.
I said, I was hoping we'd run out of time before I had to answer that question, because that's a hard question to answer. You know, like Gail, I think I've been very lucky in terms of, you know, I was raised in a very traditional culture. I had an arranged marriage. I ran away from the arranged marriage. And, but I think if there are any regrets that I have is that I didn't take the time to really visit with elders, because I was always working and always had so many things I had needed to do. And they would come here to my door, come into my office, and, you know, I didn't have the time for them. And I've always regretted that. And so now I made a change, you know, so even as busy as I am, I had a clan leader come in the other day, and she stayed for 2 hours, and I listened to it all. And but you know, that's one of the regrets that I have. And also the other thing is, I think it is, you know, when you make that decision that you are going to serve your people. I mean, and that was something, you know, that was actually trained. We were trained into doing that with the kind of cultural practices that we have. I took the place of my mother, and I was given her ceremonial, what like we call it, a kugena. And I thought about, you know, what contributions had she made to us as a community? I mean, she was a union organizer. And so I grew up, you know, taking minutes as she organized unions, you know, throughout our region to deal with the salmon industry. And so, you know, I was lucky in that I had that traditional education. And then I was lucky in terms of going off to Harvard. I mean, that was such an experience. I always say it was like somebody was opening up a curtain and I was seeing a whole new world that I hadn't seen, living in here in Southeast Alaska. And so I always wanted to have our young people have that same experience. And so I'm really, pleased that the Native corporations have established these scholarship programs, these intern programs, but there is this area of need. I mean, we as Native women, have been more fortunate than our male counterparts. And we just look at the statistics, Native women are getting educated at twice the rate as our male counterparts. So, we have to think about, if we're going to have a healthy society, then we have to bring our males along with us. We've been fortunate as Native women, but it's also important, that we train, the younger women as well. When I told that to, we have a group of interns, and I said, ladies, we need to make sure that we get more men in, and they brought me into a discussion and said, well, these are things you need to know about men today. So I'm still learning from the young. I mean, and this is the first time in our history where we are learning from younger people, and we have to be open to it. But one of the areas of concern that I have is our people who are living outside, Native people who have this yearning to reconnect with their culture. And so, we've learned, through the pandemic, that we started virtual programs, and now we're reaching, so many of our people that are having this, want to come back home or want to reconnect with their culture. I see this as one of the biggest issues that, as Native people, I see so many issues that we have to deal with. But I know in my mind, that I want that younger generation to have the same kind of benefits that we had in terms of exposure and knowledge about our traditional culture.
Thank you so much. It is really tough to wrap this up. We could certainly keep going. We only have a few more minutes left, unfortunately. So Kim, before I turn it over to you for your final comments and for you to close us out, let me just say from my perspective as an Alaskan and from our perspective at the Wilson Center, how wonderful it has been to partner with all of you in bringing just 3 events forward. They are rich, and I would just encourage anyone to go back to the website at the Polar Institute and take a look at this series of 3 events. You will have a class in and of itself, but there's a lot more to share and a lot more to do. But simply, Kim, thank you for this partnership and allowing us to work with you, your organization, and all the leadership there to bring forward these sets of policy issues, but they're personal, they're land connected, they are now. And so many issues have been teased out in just this 3 episode series. So thank you for the compliment of working with us. To all of you on the screen, I cannot thank you enough. I really cannot. Rosita, Gail, Liz, and my friend Kim, thank you. Not only today did you share issues that were covered in a title on a website and an invitation with a narrative and great subject matter. We included our senior senator, which is fantastic. We went over real issues, policy issues, land issues, all of those things related to our Alaska Native Corporation structure, and the fact that our Alaska Native corporations are so substantially important economically, socially, culturally to our own state. We covered all of that. But I want to thank you in particular for allowing us to peek inside of you. You gave us not just your official titles and your positions. You gave us a part of yourself today, insights into who you are, your education, your background, your families, your leadership, your connections. It just doesn't happen like this all the time. And that's what makes this series so much more important than others we have done. You get content, we understand things better, but we get a piece of who you are, and we're all better for it. So thank you all for this compliment. And Kim, I'll turn it over to you to closing out.
Thanks, Mike. I first want to start by thanking our panelists. Thank you for sharing your stories with us today. Each of you has had a profound impact on my life and my career, and I'm just so grateful today that others got a glimpse of the amazing women that you are. I think it was just wonderful that the senator could join us at the start and kick us off today. Her messaging was on point, and just really thank her for joining us. To all of you that joined in today, thank you for participating today and joining us virtually for this event. We hope it's provided you a glimpse and a view of these three dynamic, amazing women and our Alaska Native corporations. And I hope you take a moment to celebrate the progress that's been made of ANCSA of the last 50 years and the excitement, and share in our celebration going forward of what's to come. Lastly, I want to give a big thank you to Mike, to Michaela, and to the rest of the team at the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center. The team here is the best in the business, and we are so grateful that you've allowed us to partner with you in this series. You have allowed us to tell our story, and that is profoundly important, to hear our story from us. And thank you for providing that platform, that space, and we really look forward to continued partnership with you and your teams. You truly have become friends, and we appreciate that so much. And behalf of the ANCSA Regional Association and the Alaska Native Village Corporation Association, I just want to say thank you, and I wish everyone a safe and wonderful holiday season.
Thank you all.